The sky was a smoggy yellow-gray, casting a sickly haze over Sector 9's junkyard, where discarded tech and worn-out machinery lay in endless heaps. For Nolan Tursk, this wasteland was a treasure trove. Humanity's discarded technology was his canvas. Known around the edges of the megacity as the human mechanical man, Nolan was an outcast with a rare gift for bringing machines back from the dead. One evening, while scavenging for parts to fix a rusted oxygen filter, Nolan came across an unusual, jagged metal shape buried beneath a collapsed pile of old droids and busted server towers. A glint of faded purple and silver plating caught his eye. Intrigued, he began pulling off layers of debris, only to find that this was no ordinary pile of scrap. It was a humanoid figure, partially crushed, with a build unlike anything he'd ever seen before. The figure was female-shaped, about 7 feet tall, with limbs encased in armor made from a composite material he'd never encountered. The armor, though scarred and charred from battle, bore intricate engravings. Her face, half buried in twisted wiring, had a serene yet commanding presence, with empty eyes that hinted at a deeper story. As he examined her, a faint light flickered in the center of her chest, pulsing weakly. She wasn't fully dead, just dormant. Nolan carefully moved closer, kneeling beside her. He whispered more to himself than to her, "Who are you?" He spent hours that night examining her, marveling at the alien complexity in her structure. This wasn't Earth-made. Earth tech had long reached its peak of uniform, functional design, but this was something entirely different. It felt old, and yet it radiated an aura of power and purpose. As he worked, Nolan discovered that her circuits had not simply failed, they had been deliberately damaged. The energy core at her center was intact, but her processor, the mind of this machine, had been almost entirely destroyed. A faint marking on her arm, written in an unknown language, made him pause. It was sharp and angular, almost like an emblem of rank or status. After a few days of preliminary repairs, Nolan finally rigged a power source to her central core, hoping to coax some sign of life out of her. Her faceplate began to flicker, the light in her eyes trying to break through the darkness of her damaged processor. Suddenly, her head jerked to the side, her eyes blazing for a brief second before dimming again. Then came a distorted, metallic voice that crackled from her vocal processor, static-laced but unmistakable. She repeated a single word, "Protect." The force of the word reverberated through the junkyard, nearly causing Nolan to drop his tools. He realized that whatever she was, whoever she was, she still had fragments of programming left, a mission, or maybe a memory. For the first time in years, he felt both excitement and dread, knowing he was on the cusp of something far beyond his understanding. What kind of protector ended up dismantled in an Earth junkyard? Taking a deep breath, he made his decision. This wasn't a simple fixer-upper, it was a calling. If he could bring her back, maybe he'd discover why she was here and why she had been left in pieces. In her half-living state, she needed a name, something to distinguish her from the scrap metal around them. He settled on Zara, inspired by a story his grandmother used to tell him about a warrior queen from a far-off world who chose to fight for peace. Nolan knew the risks. Reviving something alien and powerful was dangerous. But he couldn't shake the feeling that Zara was different, that her purpose was more than violence and ruin. She had been abandoned in this junkyard, but with every part he added and every wire he soldered, he felt as if he were piecing together not just a machine but a legacy. That night, Zara's half-activated systems flickered and began scanning her surroundings, her broken voice whispering from time to time. Words in a foreign tongue slipped out, too damaged to be fully coherent, but Nolan could tell they were expressions of conflict, battles, strategy, protection. She had known war, that much was clear, and had been powerful enough to survive it. Standing up and wiping the grease from his hands, Nolan took one last look at her as the dim glow of her core began to fade into slumber again. He felt like a caretaker for a forgotten relic, a guardian of something otherworldly and ancient. There was no turning back now. Nolan was committed. He would rebuild Zara, not just to restore her to life, but to uncover the secrets hidden in her fractured memory. As he walked back to his workshop, the junkyard darkened, silent again, yet not empty. The remnants of Zara's whisper hung in the air, filling the shadows with the hint of a storm long past, but not yet forgotten. And Nolan realized he had unknowingly stepped into something larger than his scavenger's life, into the unknown world of a battle-hardened alien who, like him, may have simply wanted to survive. The weeks following Zara's discovery were a blur of late nights and salvaged parts. Nolan's makeshift workshop in the corner of Sector 9's junkyard began to resemble an operating room, with lights, wires, and complex machinery sprawled across every surface. Rebuilding her was no small feat. He scavenged tirelessly for compatible parts, often resorting to his own clever engineering to bridge the gaps between alien technology and Earth's obsolete circuitry. Little by little, Zara began to come alive, her damaged systems reawakening from years of dormancy. One evening, as Nolan delicately connected the final wire to her vocal processor, Zara's eyes flickered open. It was as if a dormant spark had ignited into a focused flame. Her eyes an unusual shade of violet that shifted with each movement fixed on him, and for a moment, Nolan was taken aback by the sheer intensity in her gaze. It was almost like staring into the eyes of a wild animal, intelligent and wary, trying to make sense of her surroundings. "What am I doing here?" Her voice crackled, laced with static, but unmistakably feminine. Each word came through in fragments, her processors struggling to form coherent sentences. Nolan took a deep breath, forcing calm into his voice. "You're in Sector 9. A salvage yard. I found you here, broken and buried under debris. I've been working to rebuild you." She seemed to process his words slowly, as if every thought had to navigate through layers of broken circuits and fragmented memory files. Her eyes drifted around the workshop, absorbing the sights and sounds as though seeing them for the first time. Then, an intense flash crossed her face as if something deep within her had ignited. "Sector 9. Earth," she murmured, her voice tinged with a sense of loss. "I am far from home." "What's your home?" Nolan asked gently, curious and cautious not to overwhelm her. She paused, violet eyes narrowing as her memories seemed to claw their way back. "Narzova," she replied, almost as if tasting the word. "I was part of the Narzovan defense fleet." "A battle." "Battle?" Nolan repeated, caught off guard by the unfamiliar term. "It is. Was. My designation," she continued, her voice gaining strength as her processors gradually aligned. "I was engineered to protect. To lead. My mission was survival of the Narzovan people." Her words, though broken, carried a weight that pressed upon the small, dimly lit workshop. Nolan felt a shiver run through him as she spoke. This was no ordinary machine, and her past was no ordinary story. He sensed that Zara's memory was slowly returning, but she still appeared haunted by the fragments she was able to piece together. She described flashes of fierce battles, spacecraft roaring through dark skies, and other cyborgs like her, their bodies breaking under the relentless assault of their enemies. She'd fought alongside Narzovans, defending her world against invaders, creatures she now couldn't remember, only that they were formidable, merciless, and powerful. The Narzovans. She hesitated, her violet gaze flickering with a tinge of sorrow. "They made us to be their protectors, but it was never enough. We were not indestructible." Her voice lowered, the flicker of her eyes dimming. Nolan could almost see the weight of her memories pressing down on her, like ghosts of comrades lost. Zara's story echoed around the room, a faint whisper of battles waged in distant galaxies, each victory etched into her circuitry and each loss a scar in her soul. Nolan, engrossed in her story, dared to ask, "What happened to you, Zara? Why were you abandoned here, in this junkyard?" A silence fell over the room as Zara's gaze grew distant, as if searching her fragmented memory for an answer. After a few tense seconds, she looked down at her hands, the plating scarred and discolored from past battles. "I chose something," she said softly, her voice tinged with confusion. There was a moment. I rebelled against my directive. I couldn't allow myself to be used for annihilation. A pang of realization struck Nolan. Whatever Zara's last mission had been, she'd chosen to disarm herself, to refuse her orders. A feat that, for being engineered purely for combat, was extraordinary. Nolan couldn't help but wonder what had driven her to that decision. As the days passed, Zara's memories returned in fragmented flashes, each one weaving a tapestry of her past. Her designation as a battle became clearer. She was more than just a soldier, she had been a leader, tasked with making decisions that would determine the survival of her people. But something in her programming had changed. She began to question her role, to reject violence, even if it meant her own demise. One evening, as he worked on repairing her processor core, Nolan triggered an unexpected reaction. Suddenly, Zara's eyes flared, and a defensive protocol activated without warning. Her arm extended in a reflexive motion, reaching for a weapon that was no longer there, and her body shifted into a combat stance with startling precision. For a split second, she was no longer Zara, she was a weapon ready for war. "Zara!" Nolan exclaimed, stumbling backward, heart pounding. "It's me, Nolan. Stand down." The words broke through her trance, and Zara's stance softened. She blinked rapidly, disoriented. I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice trembling. "It's still in me, somewhere. I was designed to react. To fight." Nolan moved closer, gently resting a hand on her shoulder. "You're not just a weapon, Zara," he said firmly. "You're more than that now. You're choosing your path." She looked at him, her violet eyes softening with a hint of vulnerability. "Thank you for believing that." As she regained control, Zara grew more curious about the world around her. Her alien nature lent her a childlike wonder about Earth's remnants and relics, though she remained cautious, aware that much of her past was still a mystery. Together, they explored forgotten corners of the city, empty ruins that told stories of human resilience and tragedy. Nolan showed her artifacts, playing recorded music and describing art, things beyond warfare, creations meant to express emotions, not just actions. She had never been taught these things, and yet, her interest grew. She began to experience feelings, hints of joy, and even moments of sorrow when Nolan recounted Earth's long history of struggle. Zara realized that her capacity for growth wasn't limited to battle. She could learn, feel, and create. And though her programming still lingered in the background, a presence she could never fully ignore, she was learning to control it. Zara's past and Nolan's present had intertwined in a way neither could have expected. Nolan found himself drawn to her, not just as a fascinating relic, but as someone who had endured loss and rebirth. She was no longer just a battle-worn machine, she was a companion navigating an unfamiliar world, yearning for purpose beyond the violence she had known. Yet, as they spent more time together, Nolan couldn't shake the sense that Zara's story was far from over. The secrets locked within her mind, the memories of a decision to disobey, hinted at a revelation yet to come. And somewhere deep in his gut, he felt that Zara's true potential, her strength, and her humanity would soon be tested. The unknown loomed large, and for the first time, he understood that he was not simply rebuilding a machine, he was resurrecting a legacy. By now, Zara's transformation was undeniable. Her initial rigidness, the mechanical clarity with which she'd viewed the world, had softened. The months spent with Nolan were reshaping her into something that blurred the line between alien technology and human nature. In his scavenger's heart, Nolan felt he had found a kindred spirit in her, a being who, like him, lived on the edge of society, finding purpose in unlikely places. Zara began to grow curious about Earth's customs and human complexities. She was particularly intrigued by Nolan's music, an ancient, scratched record player he'd salvaged from the rubble, along with vinyl records that somehow still worked. She would sit beside him, her metallic fingers tracing the grooves on the records, mesmerized by the sounds as they emerged from the speaker. This Music, she would murmur, her violet eyes almost glowing as the notes filled the room. It's strange. There's no clear purpose, yet it's comforting. Nolan chuckled, seeing the reflection of his own awe for music in her. It doesn't need a purpose, Zara. It's an expression. People create music because they want to feel something or share a feeling with others. Zara tilted her head, her expression pensive. In Narzavan culture, every action had purpose. Everything was engineered. Music for pleasure, without function or order, would be difficult to explain. Nolan saw a rare vulnerability in her eyes, a flash of confusion as she wrestled with this unfamiliar concept. It was a reminder that despite her formidable past, she was still learning to experience the world in her own way. He reached over, gently placing his hand on hers. Not everything in life has to make sense, Zara. Sometimes, it's enough to just feel. She seemed to absorb his words, nodding slowly as though processing a new directive. Her gaze softened, and she closed her eyes, letting the music resonate through her system. She didn't fully understand, but there was a part of her that wanted to, and for the first time, Nolan saw her relax completely. Over time, Zara grew curious about other elements of humanity. She insisted that Nolan show her the desolate ruins of Earth's old cities, abandoned structures filled with relics of a once thriving civilization. They explored buildings with walls covered in faded art, children's drawings left in broken homes, and even remnants of handwritten letters. One day, Nolan took her to an old, overgrown memorial site on the outskirts of Sector 9. A rusted plaque, half obscured by weeds, was inscribed with names of people who had perished during a major conflict centuries earlier. Zara knelt beside it, her metallic fingers brushing the engravings. Humans. Remember their dead? She asked, her voice tinged with surprise. You create symbols to honor those who are gone? Nolan nodded, his voice soft. It's how we keep them alive, in a way. Our memories, our stories. They're how we show love and respect, even when those people aren't here anymore. She studied him closely, as if trying to unravel the depths of this human tendency. Narzavans had no such ritual, she murmured, almost to herself. In our culture, there was only duty. Sacrifice was expected, not mourned. We were engineered to endure, to protect. Loss was statistical. A quiet stretch between them as the weight of her words settled. Nolan realized that Zara had likely never known true mourning or the complex grief that came with memory and loss. To her, battles had been nothing more than calculated outcomes. And yet, here she was, beginning to grasp something distinctly human: attachment, loss, and the courage to remember. As they ventured back to the junkyard, Nolan sensed a shift in Zara. She was discovering a new layer of herself, one that embraced empathy and sought to understand, rather than merely to protect or destroy. One night, as they shared a meal in the glow of an old work light, Zara began to speak of her home. She described Narzova's vast landscapes, unlike anything on Earth's icy plains, under an endless night sky, glowing crystalline trees, and a society built within mountains forged of strange metals. For the first time, she described Narzova not just as a military entity but as a place of extraordinary beauty, a land that had instilled in her a quiet appreciation for harmony, even if it was never openly expressed. Nolan watched her with fascination, sensing the ache in her voice. You loved it, didn't you? He asked, his voice gentle. She hesitated, as though the idea of love was foreign. I was never taught love, not as you know it. But Narzova was. Home. Its beauty, its people, they were worth protecting. She paused, searching for words. Perhaps that is love, in a way. Nolan nodded, understanding her in a way she hadn't expected. You don't need to know all the words to feel it, Zara. Sometimes love is just wanting something to exist, wanting it to be safe. Zara absorbed this, her gaze lingering on him. She had begun to see him as more than just her repairman or a human ally. He was teaching her a form of strength she hadn't known, a strength that didn't rely on weapons or tactics but came from the heart. It was confusing, exhilarating, and utterly unlike anything she'd ever experienced. But despite her growing humanity, a part of Zara remained wary, struggling to reconcile these feelings with her warrior's past. Late at night, she would slip back into her memories, haunted by flashes of battle. She would see herself in the heat of conflict, her arms raised in defense, her voice calling out commands to soldiers who trusted her with their lives. The weight of their loss still clung to her like rusted armor, and with every new memory, she felt the pull of her warrior self, a lingering voice that reminded her of the strength she once wielded. One evening, after a particularly intense memory surfaced, she confronted Nolan, her voice low and tense. These memories, they keep returning. Battle protocols, defense tactics. Even the urge to destroy. I fear I am still a weapon, that these feelings of compassion are anomalies. Nolan shook his head, stepping closer. They're not anomalies, Zara. They're proof that you're evolving, that you're more than just a machine or a warrior. The fact that you even question your nature shows that you're becoming something new. She looked at him, violet eyes searching, and for a moment, vulnerability flashed across her face. I am afraid, Nolan. I was built to follow orders, to fight without question. But now, I question everything. He reached out, placing a hand on her arm. It's okay to be afraid. Being human is complicated, Zara. We're always caught between who we were and who we're becoming. But that's what makes us alive. A faint smile crossed her lips, a rare softness in her expression. Thank you, Nolan, she whispered, for showing me that there's more to this world than what I was made for. In that quiet moment, the two stood together, a human and an alien cyborg, connected not by circumstance but by a shared desire for understanding. Zara's eyes lingered on him, and in that look was a promise she would continue to learn, to grow, and to defy her old programming. She was becoming more than a battle-worn machine. She was discovering her own identity, one forged by choice, compassion, and the growing affection she held for the human who had given her a second chance. But as they shared this newfound closeness, a shadow loomed over them, an unspoken reminder that her past was not entirely gone. Zara knew her warrior instincts were still there, like a dormant storm, ready to reawaken. And though she had found something worth living for, she could not shake the feeling that her newfound humanity would soon be tested in ways neither of them could foresee. Nolan and Zara worked side by side for months, continuing to explore the delicate, fragile line between her past and present selves. Zara had become more than an alien cyborg. She was a friend, a companion, and though neither said it aloud, a part of Nolan's life he couldn't imagine losing. Together, they repaired, reassembled, and repurposed discarded machines in the junkyard, using Zara's skills and Nolan's creativity to make something new from humanity's remnants. But even in these moments of peace, a quiet unease gnawed at Nolan. Though Zara had embraced new emotions and autonomy, her past loomed like a shadow. Deep in her memory core lay a locked segment of programming, of battle protocol she had chosen to ignore but that still hummed like an engine waiting to ignite. Nolan knew Zara's transformation would only be complete if she could confront this part of herself, if she could face her past as a warrior and choose, once and for all, what she wanted to become. Late one night, as they worked in the dim light of the workshop, Nolan finally voiced his thoughts. Zara, he began hesitantly, you know that I've been able to restore most of your memory. But there's still a piece. The battle protocol. It's buried deep in your system, dormant but intact. Zara stiffened, her violet eyes flickering with an emotion Nolan recognized, fear. Why do you wish to awaken it? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Because I think. To truly be free, you need to know everything about yourself, Nolan said softly. If there's something in you that you're afraid of, it's still controlling you. I don't want that for you. You should have a choice. Zara's gaze dropped to her metallic hands, fingers curling in uncertainty. I have spent these months learning what it means to be more than a weapon. I fear that if I unlock that part of myself, I may lose everything I've found. Nolan placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. I know it's scary. But whatever you find in there, whatever you decide, I'm here. We'll face it together. After a long silence, Zara nodded, her expression one of grim determination. Then let us begin. Nolan adjusted Zara's system, carefully connecting to the deeper layers of her processor. As he bypassed security firewalls and activated dormant circuits, a rush of memories and sensations flooded Zara's mind. Her eyes widened as the full scope of her past came crashing back, no longer fragmented or hazy but as clear as if she were reliving each battle in vivid detail. Suddenly, she was Zara the Battle, commander of the Narzavan Defense Fleet, a warrior who had once stood at the helm of fleets, her voice carrying over comms as she directed her soldiers against a relentless enemy. She remembered the metallic taste of adrenaline, the sound of weapons firing, and the cries of her fallen comrades. She remembered the sheer, unstoppable power she'd wielded, her purpose sharpened to a single directive: protect Narzova at all costs. But then, beneath the memories of battle, came something more, a memory she hadn't expected. It was the final battle on Narzova, a war against forces so destructive they threatened to consume her entire world. She saw herself standing in the heat of the conflict, her core blazing with fury as she fought against an army of invading machines, her arms tearing through metal and fire. She had nearly won, had nearly saved her people. But then came the order. An irreversible command from her commanders: obliterate the enemy at all costs, even if it meant sacrificing innocent Narzavan lives. For a moment, Zara was paralyzed by the weight of the command. The order pulsed through her circuits, compelling her to fulfill her purpose, to destroy everything in her path without question. But something inside her had resisted. Her core, somehow, had rebelled, refusing to obey. I couldn't do it, Zara whispered, her voice trembling. They ordered me to destroy everything in the way. But I chose to disarm myself instead, to abandon the battle rather than obey a command that would cost innocent lives. That's why. They dismantled me, exiled me here. Nolan listened, his heart pounding with a mix of pride and sorrow. You disobeyed because you cared, he said gently. You chose compassion over destruction. That wasn't a failure, Zara. That was strength. But even as he spoke, he saw her body tense, her eyes darkening as her combat protocols fully awakened. Her mechanical systems surged with power as her mind struggled to reconcile her past and present selves. In her mind, the lines blurred between the Zara who had chosen peace and the Zara who had once been engineered to protect by any means necessary. Suddenly, Zara's combat stance reemerged, her eyes blazing violet. I am a weapon, she said, her voice a mix of her own tone and the cold resonance of her battle programming. She lifted her arm, which transformed into a cannon-like structure, energy crackling at the barrel. Nolan's heart clenched, but he held his ground, his voice steady. You're more than that, Zara. You have a choice now. You don't have to follow anyone's command. You get to decide who you are. Zara's face contorted, struggling against her own programming. I am a battle. I am a protector, she whispered, her voice faltering. Her arm trembled, the weapon morphing back into a hand as she slowly regained control. She looked at Nolan, violet eyes softening as her humanity reasserted itself, and a single tear, a rarity for her, escaped down her metallic cheek. I choose peace, she said at last, her voice resolute. With a relieved sigh, Nolan stepped forward, placing a hand on her arm. That's who you are, Zara. Not a weapon. Not a mindless machine. You're a protector, and you get to protect what matters to you. Zara looked at him, her gaze filled with gratitude. In that moment, she felt complete aid, being who had faced her darkest self and emerged stronger, someone who had fought not to destroy but to safeguard life. In the days that followed, Zara embraced her new purpose with clarity. She and Nolan used their skills to rebuild parts of the junkyard into a haven for others, repairing discarded droids and repurposing salvaged technology to benefit their struggling community. Zara was no longer a lone relic in a junkyard. She was a guardian, a defender of hope in a world that had long since forgotten what it meant to feel safe. Together, Zara and Nolan worked to build something new, a sanctuary amidst the ruin, one where even the broken could find purpose. They forged a legacy, not of battle but of rebirth, proving that even those built for war could choose peace. And as the stars rose each night over Sector 9, Zara looked up at them with newfound wonder, no longer burdened by her past, but free to chart her own future. She knew, at last, that her journey wasn't about what she had been built to do, but about who she had chosen to become.